And welcome back. Updates from the Russian invasion. A magnitude 6.9 earthquake struck off the far eastern coast of Russia yesterday. The Russian Emergency Ministry claimed there had been no tsunami nor any immediate casualties or destruction. According to the Emergency Ministry, the earthquake struck about 44 kilometers south of Petropavlovsky, Kamchatka, on Russia's Pacific coast at a depth of 100 kilometers. Footage shows some cracks in buildings and bottles smashed in supermarkets after being dislodged by the quake. But no major immediate structural damage has been sustained. Meanwhile, Russia said it launched attacks on multiple fronts and shot down Ukrainian drones, while Ukraine said it had repelled rounds of Russia's offensive in Bakhmut. According to the official briefings of the two countries, the Russian Ministry of Defense said the Russian army launched offensives in multiple directions, such as Kupiansk, Lyman, and Donetsk. Russian air defense forces intercepted multiple rockets and shot down multiple drones. On the other hand, the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces said in a battle report that the Russian army continued to attack Bakhmut and tried to gain complete control over the region. The Ukrainian army repelled dozens of attacks by the Russian army in Bakhmut. In the past 24 hours, Ukrainian artillery units struck targets including concentration areas of Russian manpower and equipment, command posts, and air defense system positions. And Finland has officially become NATO's 31st member of NATO Security Alliance, doubling the length of member states' borders with Russia. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said Finland's accession to NATO is a historic event, adding the alliance would ensure that Sweden will also become a full-fledged member. Stoltenberg also said he was confident that Sweden would soon join NATO. Meanwhile, Helsinki residents welcomed Finland becoming a member of NATO, saying it will bring security to their country, which shares a long border with Russia. Finland's flag will be raised outside NATO headquarters on the outskirts of Brussels alongside those of the alliance's 30 other member countries before a gathering of NATO foreign ministers. The event marks the end of an era of military non-alignment for Finland, which began after the country repelled an invasion attempt by the Soviet Union during World War II and opted to try to maintain friendly relations with neighboring Russia.
I feel it's a good thing that Finland is joining NATO. We have been here next to Russian for ages, and I feel that it's good because my father was in war with the Russians, so this is like a personal thing to me.
In some ways, I think it will make Finland a safer place, but then again, we don't know what Russia will do, and it's all like a big question for me. I think so.
Now we are part of Western Europe and this kind of bigger community, so we are part of this Northern Alliance, so that brings a security to Finland. Yeah.
In the meantime, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu says Finland joining NATO raises risks of conflict, adding that it would not affect the outcome of what Russia calls its special military operation in Ukraine. Russia says one of the reasons why it sent its armed forces into Ukraine in February 2022 was to counter a threat from what it said were Western plans to use Ukraine as a platform to threaten Russia.
Но на исход в этих условиях мы принимаем ответные меры.
NATO is taking a range of steps to increase the combat readiness of the joint armed forces. They're intensifying combat training and reconnaissance activities near the borders of Russia and Belarus. In the near future, Finland will become a member of the alliance. Of course, all this creates risk of a significant escalation of the conflict, but it will not affect the outcome of the special military operation.
And the Kremlin said it would be forced to take countermeasures to ensure Russia's security in response to Finland's accession to the NATO military alliance. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov called Helsinki's move to join the bloc an encroachment on Russia's security, adding that the structure of NATO was hostile towards Russia. UNESCO Director General Audrey Azoulay met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Chernihiv, north of Kiev, to discuss the city's potential inclusion in the UN body's World Heritage List. Azoulay and Zelensky also discussed efforts to further protect Ukrainian cultural sites and promote education in the country, as well as the coordination of international support in those fields. And the European Union's top diplomat said China has a moral duty to contribute to peace in Ukraine and must not support the aggressor in the war started by Russia's invasion. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who was speaking with EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell in Brussels, announced that the United States and the European Union are exploring ways to further reduce Europe's dependence on Russia's energy. And joining us in studio is our guest, David Otto, who we will be discussing with about what's going on in Russia. David, I just want to know, Finland officially becomes a member of the NATO military alliance today, and it comes after Finland submitted a joint application for the membership alongside Sweden shortly after the invasion of Russia into Ukraine. Now, this is a historic moment. It's undeniable for the Nordic country. What does this mean for Finland?
It does mean a lot. Of course, April 4th will be seen as a significant day for Finland. Of course, because it now becomes a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and that means Finland will enjoy Article 5, which means an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all. But significantly, what it also does, which must not be forgotten, is that it has now turned Finland into a foe instead of a friend that it used to be. Of course, Finland used to be, observe the policy of non-alignment, as you earlier said, which made it some kind of a buffer. But now that Finland has made a decision to join NATO, it has now turned itself into a foe, and the consequence of that could be severe, perhaps, but that would depend on what Russia does. But I think this is more of a win, not for Finland, but a win for NATO, because of course NATO has now expanded its reach, within the Russian borders with another 800,000 miles. And that is very important because it therefore means that in the event that there is an attack, it makes it a lot more easier for NATO to launch attacks, against Russia. It's about 6 NATO members now who are bordering Russia by land, and 2, Romania and Turkey by the Black Sea. So the number of NATO members surrounding, Russia has now increased. And this, of course, was one of the reasons, according to Russia, that forced it to carry out the special military operation into Ukraine, because, of course, they wanted to stop Ukraine from becoming a member of NATO. But this is what you call the unintended consequence of these 405 days of war since it began.
And so, David, you are saying that 810-mile border with Russia definitely does have some serious effects.
It does have a serious effect. It therefore means that there is now a vulnerability line that exists, with Finland, which of course is now a member of NATO. So NATO does have responsibility to protect that region. But what that would mean, effectively in military terms, is that it may now require Russia to put more forces, along that 800 plus 1,000 miles, of border that it shares with Finland, and that's a huge take on Russia's resources. It's a huge diversion, considering the fact that it is now fighting an unending war, it seems perhaps in Ukraine. So it's a big challenge, for Russia. And as you could see, Russia is already reacting to that and, making all sorts of threats. But one has to see what really happens next.
That's certainly true, David. Now, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said that Finland's accession to the NATO military alliance and NATO's move to increase its own combat readiness would increase the risk of conflict. That's something that you would say you would agree with, David?
I do not disagree with that. One of the things that we've seen in this conflict, is rather than some level of de-escalation, what we continuously see is escalation. If Finland is now joining NATO, it therefore means that this poses further threats to Russia, and we've seen that Russia, continuously, claims that Ukraine, for example, becoming a member of NATO was an existential threat. What Russia is left with at this point in time, in terms of the 8 member states or NATO member states that surround it, they're left with Belarus, and of course, with Ukraine, that hasn't become a member of NATO. So I think, the lines drawn very thin in terms of, that existential threat which Russia defines. And perhaps, what one could possibly see is, Russia deploying, its forces along those borders, and then Finland becoming rather a target instead of a country that, has sat in that region as a member that is non-aligned, between NATO and, of course, the current state of Russia and the former Soviet Union.
Now, with the Kremlin saying Russia will have to respond to Finland joining NATO, should the Finns be worried and gearing up for a possible counteroffensive?
I don't think Russia would want to do that at this point in time because, Finland is now a member of NATO. And again, as I mentioned earlier on, Article 5 then applies. If Russia were to, invade, Finland in the same style that it did in Ukraine, it would eventually attract the entire 30 member states plus Finland, which is 31. It will have to deal with them on the Article 5 principle. So I think it's a little bit too late for Russia to do anything. What might happen is we would see some escalation. And this is one of the reasons, according to the Russian own perspective, that they decided to invade Ukraine. Because, by Ukraine being in a current conflict, it will not, qualify to become a member of NATO. And perhaps, one of the reasons why Russia believes that it will continue to fight in Ukraine, just to ensure that by no means would Ukraine be accepted as a member while there is an ongoing conflict. But if they had to stop, Finland, or they have to stop countries like Sweden, then perhaps, what they could have done, or they could have done a similar special military operation. But because they failed to do that in the case of Finland, Finland is now a full member of NATO, and, there's nothing much they can do about the current situation. But, one can never tell, what the Russians, are capable of doing.
Indeed. Well said, David. And now let's talk about the issue of tanks and fighter jets. Do you think the provision of continuous military weapons to Ukraine by the West only serves to deteriorate the war?
Of course, it's not just, these weapons, but we talk about the sanctions that have been levied against Russia. We talk about the money that has been sent, from the West, or that continuously is being sent to Ukraine to fight the war from the West and the US, from NATO member states. You talk about some of the volunteer fighters, who are now being encouraged in some countries to go and fight, for Ukraine. So all this, is to, keep the war going. Again, without doubt, this is a proxy war between NATO and Russia, and of course, and other states that are in support of the US and NATO's, geopolitical strategy. So, this is going to continue. I think it is going to be who is going to blink last, or who is going to, decide to withdraw first. Now, the conditions has always been that, Russia should withdraw its forces completely from Ukraine. But of course, the Ukrainians are also saying that Russia needs to withdraw its forces from Crimea, which is going to be a very difficult, situation. There is no safe face strategy for Russia to come out of the war as we speak. So, what the West is doing now is to ensure that, it can continuously sponsor the war and weaken Russia's economy, as it has done through sanctions, weaken its military as it continues to support the war, and then create a diversionary tactics, which is, of course, bringing countries like Finland and Sweden to become a member of NATO. Now that diverts the attention of Russia, not just, focusing on Ukraine, but now they have to think about what happens, as far as Finland and Sweden is concerned.
And finally, David, before I let you go, I want to get your opinion on the issue of nuclear weapons. What do you make of Russia's announcement to station tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus?
This is a tactical but also a strategic move by Russia. I mean, what NATO has, as its advantage in this war is that it could, incorporate countries like Finland and perhaps, Sweden into the alliance, thereby extending NATO's reach towards Russia's border. Russia doesn't have, a similar approach. So, for example, Russia doesn't have the Soviet Union. It's just Russia. They don't have, of course, there are talks of, China supporting Russia to some extent, but China has made it very clear that it is neutral. So Russia cannot do what NATO does, by incorporating member states, into, the Russian alliance, if you want to use that word. What it does have is its nuclear, capabilities, and that is what it is using. Now, for every move that NATO does, for example, incorporating Finland into its membership, what Russia will do in reverse, or to try and reverse the situation, or create some kind of a balance, is to say that, we would station our nuclear heads in Belarus, which is one of the last, buffer countries that Russia does have. So it's kind of a military quid pro quo, for Russia. And, they're making sure that, they say that very loudly and very clearly.
All right, David, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And moving on, UNESCO Director General Audrey Azoulay met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Chernihiv, north of Kiev, to discuss the city's potential inclusion in the UN body's World Heritage List. Azoulay and Zelensky also discussed efforts to further protect Ukrainian cultural sites and promote education in the country, as well as the coordination of international support in those fields.
Thank you so much. Good message of supporting us, supporting Ukraine. You're very welcome.
It's first an honor for us to do so as UNESCO. I can imagine the human toll of war and all you're going through, but I appreciate that you give importance to the human dimension of it through the protection of culture and education, because we know that it defines Ukraine as a nation, and it is our mission in UNESCO to be on your side, to be on the side of the Ukrainian people, to protect this cultural heritage, to protect.
And Finland has officially become NATO's 31st member of NATO Security Alliance, doubling the length of member states' borders with Russia. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said Finland's accession to NATO is a historic event, adding the alliance would ensure that Sweden will also become a full-fledged member. Stoltenberg also said he was confident that Sweden would soon join NATO.
NATO now apply represent to Finland, and what will...
Today is an historic day because in a few hours we will welcome Finland as the 31st member of our alliance. This will make Finland safer and NATO stronger. By becoming a member, Finland will get an ironclad security guarantee. Article 5, our collective defense clause, one for all for one, will now, from today, apply for Finland. There will be no NATO troops in Finland without the consent of Finland. And of course, what we have in many countries is that we have exercises, we have naval and air presence and so on, but we don't have permanent bases. And this has not been an issue so far in our discussions with Finland. What remains when it comes to Sweden is the ratification in two parliaments. I'm confident that will happen. I met with President Erdogan some weeks ago. I also spoke with him on the phone recently, and we agreed, of course, first of all, to ensure that Finland becomes a full member, that the accession process is now finalized for Finland. But we also agreed to restart the process, the meetings of the permanent mechanism, the meetings of Finland, Sweden, and Turkey, to ensure also that we can make progress on the ratification of Sweden.
And German Chancellor Olaf Scholz assured Moldova of Berlin's support on its path to accession to the European Union as Moldovan and American officials allege Russia of trying to weaken the government in Chisinau. Speaking at a news conference in Bucharest, Romania, alongside Romanian President Klaus Iohannis and Moldovan President Maia Sandu, Mr. Scholz said, quote, "Moldova is part of our European family. In the summer, we granted it candidate status, and I very much welcome how resolutely Moldova has tackled the necessary reforms that are indispensable for EU accession." Scholz also expressed great concern about reports of alleged Russian attempts to destabilize Moldova and said Germany would do its part to support Moldova in arming itself against attempts of destabilizing by Russia.
Este foarte important pentru